Madame Ludmilla was never a faithful wife. This was known to everyone, including her friends, her husband's friends, and even her husband himself. Her husband, Mr. Nikolai, had long come to terms with this. Madame Ludmilla explained it by saying, "What can I do? That's just my temperament." Indeed, Madame Ludmilla had quite a temperament. She was a voluptuous brunette with black eyes and voluminous curls. Even now, as she reached retirement age, she looked quite good. No one ever saw any gray in her hair. Whether this was due to natural reasons or because the Italian dye was good, was unknown. Madame Ludmilla still had men despite her age. She never had permanent lovers, as that was too bothersome and uninteresting. She much preferred occasional flings lasting a day or two. Mr. Nikolai, in contrast to his wife, had a more melancholic character. He was an elderly, slightly balding brunette, not too tall, not too heavy. In general, an average man. His melancholic nature was aided by his work. He was a doctor and claimed that he had seen people inside and out and was no longer surprised by anything. And this was entirely true. Everything in the couple's life had long been settled. They had recently moved from a small, inconvenient apartment in the city center to a luxurious 3-room apartment on the outskirts. A company had bought out their 2-room apartment in the center for an outrageous amount of money to use as an office. Their children were already grown up, their daughter was finishing college, and their son was in his 4th year at the Polytechnic Institute. Officially, Madame Ludmilla and Mr. Nikolai were already retired but continued to work. After all, who lives on a pension these days? Besides, doctors are known to work until deep old age. Madame Ludmilla was also a doctor, though not practicing. She held a decent, though not the highest, position in the regional health ministry. It seemed that everything in life had long been settled, and everything was planned out until death. And then suddenly, her husband declared that he wanted a divorce. Madame Ludmilla cheerfully said, "You might as well say you're leaving for a young lover." "Yes," her husband calmly confirmed. "We want to get married. We have a daughter, Alexandra, she's already a year old, and I want her to grow up with her father. Our children are already grown, they don't need a father's care, and I don't owe them alimony. And I've already told you, you'll have more space without me. And you can live as you please." Madame Ludmilla sat down. Literally, she sat down on the couch and couldn't get up, her legs trembling. "And who is she?" Madame Ludmilla inquired. "Her name is Angelina," her husband, or rather her ex-husband, calmly replied. "She's 28 years old, and she works as a nurse in our hospital. We will live at her place, and I'll only take my personal belongings." The divorce happened. Or rather, there was no official divorce. Nikolai took his things and left for his lover. Another 6 months later, the divorce was officially finalized. Mr. Nikolai adopted the new daughter, deregistered from his ex-wife's apartment, and everything went on as usual. Madame Ludmilla, after the initial shock, was even glad. The apartment indeed became more spacious. No one snored, sniffed, or ran to the bathroom at night. The children were grown up and mostly ate in cafes, so she hardly had to cook. It was wonderful. The ex-husband periodically, about once every 6 months, called to ask how things were going and if any help was needed. Madame Ludmilla politely communicated with him and gave the standard answer, "No. No help needed." Mr. Nikolai periodically met with the children, gave them birthday gifts, and attended the wedding of their elder son. Everything was like normal people. The terrible thing happened 8 years later. On the morning of Friday, November 13th, Angelina called Madame Ludmilla and informed her that Nikolai had a stroke the previous evening. He was in the second hospital, and she wasn't allowed to see him yet. They said he would live, but what the consequences would be were unknown. Madame Ludmilla, using her connections in the medical field, mobilized half the city. By the evening, a council of the best doctors in the city had gathered in Mr. Nikolai's hospital room. For better or worse, Mr. Nikolai survived. His consciousness was practically unaffected, but unfortunately, his mobility was almost entirely lost. He also had difficulty speaking. Naturally, Madame Ludmilla did everything she could, utilizing her connections. All the necessary examinations were conducted right there in the hospital. His disability status was processed remotely. An envelope with all the documents and his disability certificate was delivered directly to Mr. Nikolai's home. Madame Ludmilla could do no more for her ex-husband. Another 6 months passed when Angelina called again. "Madame Ludmilla," said the new wife of her ex-husband, "I need to have a serious talk with you. I don't know what to do. Nikolai, of course, tries not to be a burden to our daughter and me, but I physically can't manage anymore. I have to work 2 shifts. After work, I'm barely alive. At home, there's my daughter and a paralyzed husband. The child is only 9 years old, and she sees all this every day. We're both going crazy." The woman's voice quivered suspiciously. "I can't just send him to a nursing home." There was a pause on the line, then Angelina continued. "Take your husband back. You have a large apartment and grown-up children." "I can't take it anymore," the young wife pleaded. "I'll help financially as much as I can. I can't take it anymore. I beg you." Angelina desperately sobbed into the phone. "I'll think about it," said Madame Ludmilla. Madame Ludmilla thought it over, consulted with her children, went to church, something she had never done before. She stood by the icon, thought, lit a candle, and left. Then she called her best friend and consulted with her. The friend indignantly exclaimed, "Why do you need him? He left you for a young girl, let her take care of him." After her friend's words, Madame Ludmilla made her final decision. Her husband was not really a bad person. He probably only cheated on her once. Yes, it wasn't in a drunken state or a casual fling. He genuinely fell in love, and there was also a small child. She was already retired. Her pension, as a former official of the health ministry, was decent. She had no grandchildren yet, and Nikolai was still her husband. They had lived together for 35 years. The children were ready to help. Perhaps it was time to atone for her sins. Madame Ludmilla agreed. Mr. Nikolai was brought back to his former apartment in a wheelchair. Angelina thanked Madame Ludmilla almost on her knees. She honestly transferred money to her. Of course, it didn't solve the problems, but at least it covered the cost of medication. Nikolai's youngest daughter visited her father every few months. Naturally, there was no practical help from a 10-year-old child, but it was still a moral comfort. Mr. Nikolai tried not to complain about anything, thanked his wife for everything, and sighed, saying, "I'm sorry, God is punishing me for my sins." "What sins do you have?" his former, or perhaps now once again, current, wife dismissed his words. "It's my sins. He is punishing me." "What sins do you have?" Mr. Nikolai said sincerely. "So what, you cheated a couple of times." It was unknown who was right, whose sins were heavier, or if there were any sins at all. Mr. Nikolai passed away 3 years later at the age of 76. In the last week of his life, with his weakening tongue, he thanked his wife for everything and said she was a saint. At Mr. Nikolai's funeral, both families and all 3 children were present. He left no inheritance, so there was nothing to divide. 3 years later, Madame Ludmilla also suffered a stroke. The children devotedly take care of their mother and take her outside to get some fresh air in the wheelchair that belonged to her husband. Who and for what does God punish?